I think it's fair to say that most Christian people would be totally shocked to learn that the entire Christian church, during the time that the New Testament was being written, all the books of the New Testament, that the entire Christian church during that period of time observed the seventh-day Sabbath, without exception. I do not mean Sunday, because in fact, much of the Christian world up through World War II kind of observed the Sabbath, but they called Sunday the Sabbath. I remember many times in the Baptist church here, you even lead in prayer and talk about Lord bless us on this glorious Sabbath morning. But as the years have gone by, most churches have moved away from that concept, realizing that it really isn't the Sabbath, that the Sabbath is the day before that, and so they speak of it as the Lord's Day in other terms. I don't mean that. I mean that during that first century, that the Apostolic Church observed the seventh-day Sabbath, and it is really beyond dispute. Beyond dispute. It's not a matter of a few proof texts. It's something that's woven into the very fabric of the Bible. Now, first of all, I don't know of anyone who would doubt for a moment that the seventh-day Sabbath was the universally recognized day of rest and worship among all Jews when Christ came on the scene. I don't know of anybody. There may be someone somewhere. But Jews far and wide, near and far, the diaspora, all over the known universe at that time, observed seventh-day Sabbath. That was their day of rest and worship. And I think the first step in making my point that I opened with today, that is that during that first century, the entire Christian church, without exception, observed the seventh-day Sabbath. First step is understanding and grasping the importance of the Sabbath among the Jewish community when Jesus taught among them. When Jesus first stepped out in his public ministry, walked into a synagogue, stood up to read, and read to them, we know that it was on a Sabbath day. My question for you is, what was the attitude, the prevailing attitude of the people in the synagogue on that day concerning the Sabbath? What did they think about it? What was the depth of their dedication to it? How firmly was it held? How important was it to a Jew of that time and of that place? The first place I want to take you today is to Exodus, the 34th chapter, in verse 12. Exodus 31, in verse 12. Bear in mind that these their scriptures extremely well and had great portions of them memorized, and I have little doubt that this would have been one that almost any adult male in Judea could have cited for you from memory. Exodus 31, verse 12. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths you shall keep. It is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Jehovah, that does sanctify you, that sets you apart. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone that defiles it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done. But in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Now I know immediately that there will be those who want to argue, well, yeah, that's fine. I agree. That was for Israel. I'm not an Israelite. Doesn't apply to me. That's not what we're talking about today. What I'm talking about today is the attitude of the Jew in the first century who sat and heard Jesus speak for the first time. What was his attitude toward the Sabbath? He saw the Sabbath day as a sign between him and God, that God was his God and he belonged to God. It was an identifying sign between the two of them. It was perpetual. It was to be kept throughout all generations on pain of death. So it was a very serious matter for him as a Jew at this time. Now they had not only this particular commandment, they also had a terrible, terrible lesson from their own history relative to this. A lesson that was attested to by the prophets, one in particular named Ezekiel. If you'll turn back to Ezekiel chapter 20, I'd like to point out to you the emphasis that God lays on the Sabbath day
in the events that took place in the fall and restoration of Israel. In Ezekiel chapter 20, and I'll begin reading at verse 5. Thus saith the Lord God, in the day when I chose Israel and lifted up my hand to the seed of the house of Jacob, and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, when I lifted up my hand to them, saying, I am the Lord your God, naming himself, by the way, Jehovah your God. In the day that I lifted up my hand to them to bring them forth out of the land of Egypt to a land that I had espied for them, flowing with milk and honey, this is the glory of all lands. I said to them, cast away your idols, every man the abomination of his eyes. Defile not yourselves with the idols of Egypt, for I am the Lord your God. Now, what you'll have here in this section of prophecy, there are about 3 stanzas in here, and they have certain phrases that keep recurring in common to them. One of them is this one, but they rebelled against me, and they would not listen to me. They did not every man cast away the abominations of their eyes. They did not forsake the idols of Egypt. So I said, I will pour out my fury upon them to accomplish my anger against them in the land of Egypt. Before they ever got out of Egypt, we have this problem. And it's interesting, the development of thought. The first thing is, let's start off with the idols of Egypt. Let's start off getting ourselves away from this. And they were in a rebellious spirit in mind before they ever got out of there. And his anger is raised against them. Then comes this is the next phrase that is recurrent in this theme. But I wrought for my name's sake. God realized and says, I'd worked on this. I made steps on this for the sake of my own reputation, which is what he's talking about here. And it occurs again and again with Moses and God saying, you don't want to do this. You don't want to destroy these people because the pagans will hear about it and they'll say, well, God, you weren't able to do this. Your own reputation is at stake here. And God recognized it. My own reputation is at stake. So I worked for my name's sake, that it should not be polluted before the heathen, before whom they were, in whose sight I made myself known to them, and bring them out of the land of Egypt. So I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt. I brought them into the wilderness. And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctifies them. Here's this theme is back to us again. He says, look, I spoke to you in Egypt to get away from the idols. He didn't say anything to them in Egypt about the Sabbath, did he? They were out of there before that subject ever came up. But they did get into the wilderness, and the time came that God began to work with these people. And he said, I want you to understand there's going to be a sign, a banner, a mark, something that you and I will know one another. It's the day we meet on, and it's one day in 7. It's the 7th day. It's the Sabbath. And it's so you can know who I am. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They didn't walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which if a man does, he will live in them. My Sabbaths they greatly polluted. So I said I would pour out my fury on them in the wilderness to consume them. Now, he was ready to pour out his fury on them in Egypt. He didn't do it for his own reputation's sake. Now in the wilderness, he's ready to do it again. But he says, I wrought for my name's sake. So the pattern gets repeated. It's threefold, I think, in this passage here that is repeated. I wrought for my name's sake, that it should not be polluted before the heathen, in whose sight I brought them out. I lifted up my hand in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land that I had given them. So I made a promise. You're not going into the land which flows with milk and honey, the glory of all lands. Why? Because they despised my judgments. They wouldn't walk in my statutes. They polluted my Sabbaths. In the wilderness. They didn't get to the promised land before they were going astray. And their heart went after their idols. Nevertheless, my eye spared them from destroying them. Neither did I make an end of them in the wilderness. But I said to their children in the wilderness, don't walk in the statutes of your fathers. Don't observe their judgments. Don't defile yourself with their idols. Don't make this mistake. You made it in Egypt. We're out of Egypt. Your fathers made it again. Now please don't make this mistake. Walk in my statutes, keep my judgments, do them, and hallow my Sabbaths. Why? They shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. The Sabbath is a sign of Jehovah. You know, it is. That's as simple as that. No stepping aside from it. Notwithstanding, the children even rebelled against me, and they didn't walk in my statutes or keep my judgments. They got into the land. They polluted his Sabbaths. And I said, I would pour out my fury upon them to accomplish my anger against them in the wilderness. But, nevertheless, I withdrew my hand and wrought for my name's sake, that it should not be polluted in the sight of the heathen, in whose sight I had brought them forth. I lifted up my hand to them in the wilderness, and I said that I would scatter them among the heathen, and disperse them throughout all the countries, because they had not executed my judgments, had despised my statutes, and polluted my Sabbaths, and gone after their fathers' idols. Now, by this time, the Israelites who were there when Jesus came on the scene, these were people who knew the lessons of history very well. They knew the sins of their fathers in Egypt, and they knew the pollution of the Sabbath day in the wilderness that had got them into deep trouble with God. They knew that the polluting of the Sabbath when they got into the land during the times of the kingdom had led to their exile into Babylon for all those long years. The lesson of maintaining the Sabbath had been driven home in these people pretty extensively to where they were not likely to ever forget it again by this time. So the Jews to whom Jesus came and before whom he spoke in synagogue understood, knew the Sabbath, and were committed to the Sabbath. Now, know something else. Judaism, like Christianity, is highly sectarian. There is something in human nature that causes us to divide, and as a consequence, just like in Christianity in the modern world, you've got a jillion different sects and denominations. I think there were 400 or so when I was a boy, and now who knows what that number is. Nobody's even counting them anymore. There are so many. Well, in Christ's day, the Judaism of the time there were two, what we would probably today call mainstream elements of Judaism, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But then there was a very large subgroup called the Essenes, and they were divided again. One of their small subgroups was down in the Qumran community, and these were the people who maintained the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been discovered with so much interest in later times. So they were sectarian. But there's a very interesting thing about Judaism. With all of their sects and all of their divisions, all of the sects, all of the divisions kept the Sabbath day, and they kept it on the same day. There was no dissension among Jews, not that I've ever run across, that there were some Jews who kept the Sabbath on Wednesday, or some kept it on Sunday, or some kept it on Friday, or whatever. That was not a factor. The Sabbath day was the identifying sign of the very God they served, and you couldn't play around with the sign. They all understood that. And they all learned it from Exodus, the 16th chapter. They not only understood about the Sabbath, they understood unequivocally which day it was. In Exodus, the 16th chapter, and I'll begin reading this time in verse 4. I won't take time to read all this chapter to you or discuss the whole thing, although there is much of interest in this passage. I want only to establish one thing with it. The Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'll rain bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or not." Thus, the Sabbath is the test commandment. That's the one God used to decide, are you going to do this? Do you really mean it, or don't you? Because if we can't get past this commandment, we got nowhere we can go together. Think about the significance of that for a Jew. God says, this is the test. I'm going to find out. If we can't get past this one, we have nowhere to go together, because this one is the sign between me and you as to who I am and who you are. So, he says in verse 5, "It came to pass on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in. It shall be twice as much as they gather daily." The lesson is going to be driven home. You gather manna every day, only as much as you need in a day. And by now, most people who've ever read the Bible know this story by heart. They were to gather as much as they needed, no more, no less. If they kept any of it over till the next morning, it would breed worms and stink. 1 day's supply in 1 day. Why are we going to all this trouble to make this work this way? Well, the 6th day, you gather twice as much. This time you can keep it over, and it doesn't breed worms and stink. The whole lesson is to drive home in people's minds that there is one day in 7, one explicit, defined, designated day in 7, that is your Sabbath day, and no other. Simple as that. Verse 14. "When the dew was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing like the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel, they said to one another, 'It's manna,' and the Hebrew word manna simply means, 'What is it?' They said, 'What is it?' They didn't know what it was. And Moses said, 'This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat.' This is the thing which the Lord commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take every man for those who are in your tents. So they did. They took more, some less, depending on how many people they had. When they meted it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. How hungry are you? This is what we're going to get. And Moses said, don't leave any of it till the morning. And typically, they didn't listen to Moses. But they thought they might want a snack in the morning before sunup, so they kept some of it till the morning. It bred worms, and it stank, and apparently it was pretty widespread and smelled up the joint pretty bad because Moses was furious about it. So anyway, they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, and the sun waxed hot, it melted. So the discipline is settled in, starts settling in from day 2, when some people kept it over, and we have a problem. And by the time we get to day 6, everybody by now knows you're not supposed to keep any of it over until the morning. And typical of human nature, there are always some people who don't get the word no matter what you do. And so this time, some of them did remember and said, this is the 6th day. We can gather twice as much on that day. And they did, verse 22. 2 omers for a man, and the rulers of the congregation came and said, wait a minute, something's wrong here. They're actually gathering more than necessary. And Moses said, that's fine. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, seethe what you will seethe, and that which remains over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. Now, what's fascinating about this little passage of Scripture, and this is a sidelight, is that the 10 Commandments had not yet been given. And by some people's reckoning, the Sabbath had not been established because they believed that the Sabbath didn't exist before the 10 Commandments were given. Now, in my own case, I believe the Sabbath existed from creation when God rested on the 7th day. But if the Sabbath didn't exist until the 10 Commandments were given, how is it that Moses said, tomorrow is, not shall be, tomorrow is the Sabbath, the rest of the holy Sabbath. Bake what you will bake today, seethe what you will seethe, and that which remains over, lay up for you to be kept to the morning. And they did, and didn't breed worms, and it didn't stink. Marvelous. And so on we go. Now, Moses said, eat that today. This is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it. The 7th day is the Sabbath. There shall be none. And it came to pass, typically, that there were some people who weren't paying attention, did not gather any extra on Friday, and so they were out on Saturday morning. And they went out to find some, and there wasn't any. No doubt, knowing Israelites, they complained about it. And the Lord said to Moses, how long is it going to take for you people to get this lesson through your head? Of course, in all fairness, it's only been 1 week, and there are those people who have a hard time learning things. Anyway, he said, how long is this going to take? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. So he gave you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide you every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place until the 7th day, on the 7th day. And the people rested on the 7th day. So, when Jesus walked onto the scene, the Sabbath was an established and honored tradition in every sect of Jerusalem, and there was no dispute over the day because that had been settled a long time before. There was no question in Judaism that you can pick your day. There was no question in Judaism you can decide to observe Wednesday or Tuesday or Monday because I need to work on Saturday. This was not done. Everybody observed the Sabbath. They all observed it on the same day. That was God's day. He set it aside, put his name on it, his presence in it. Now, this was of special importance because the observance of the Sabbath on the day appointed by God himself, was the identifying sign that they were worshiping Jehovah and not someone else. Remember the wording in both Exodus and in Ezekiel? How that he says, this is the sign between you and me that I am Jehovah your God. So consequently, the failure to observe the Sabbath, the rejection of the Sabbath in favor of another day, the fooling around with it and changing the days of it, would be perceived by a Jew not merely as a sectarian issue, not merely as a doctrinal issue that your little sect over here has a doctrine of Wednesday and our little sect over here has a doctrine of Saturday. This was not a sectarian doctrinal issue. This was a question of who was your God. This is important to understand the mindset of the Jew who sat and heard Jesus speak. Now we come to the question of Jesus' own attitude toward the Sabbath day. After his baptism, Jesus, went away in the wilderness, fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. After that 40 days and 40 nights, he was tempted by the devil. And he proceeded through all that temptation, succeeded, and afterward the angels came and ministered to him. And following the baptism, the 40-day fast, and the test, Jesus began his ministry. What is the first thing that we have recorded of all the things that Jesus did as he begins his ministry? Turn to Luke 4. Luke 4 is one of those places that this whole set of events is recorded. And by the way, this particular set is, I believe, in all three of the Gospels, or there's a temptation in all three of the synoptic Gospels. It says, Jesus returned, Luke 4 and verse 14. He returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went out a fame of him through all the regions round about. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. This is normalcy itself. And why would anyone imagine anything else? Jesus was a Jew. He had grown up in a Jewish culture. His mother and stepfather were Jews. The religion was the religion of the Jews. It was the worship of Jehovah. It was the worship of the God of the Old Testament. It was the worship of the great God of all of them. Where else would he be but in the synagogue? And what other day would he be there except the Sabbath day? That's not hard to figure, and I don't know of anyone who would have any trouble understanding that. But what is interesting about it is that it basically says, Luke makes the point of saying, it was his custom. It was what everybody did. There was delivered to him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And he opened up the book, found the place where it was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, gave it back to the minister, and sat down. And the eyes of all them in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say to them, this day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears. And what day was that? It was the Sabbath day, of course. Now, let's pause and think about the implications of what I've just told you. In the light of the assertion that I made when I began this, that entire New Testament church observed the Sabbath day during that first century period while all the apostles were still alive. Because what I have done, first of all, is to lay for you the groundwork, the mindset of the audiences to whom Jesus spoke, and this is important for us to know what their expectations were, what their responses might have or would have been or should have been to anything Jesus said and what Jesus did. And then to look at what Jesus did and said in that light and try to understand what was happening. Was it Jesus' intent to change the day of worship later for his disciples? After all this history, after all the commandments, after all the instructions in Exodus, after the experience of the Israelites in a captivity that was generated, God says specifically, because they polluted his Sabbaths, among many other things, after all that history leading up to this time, was it Jesus' intent to abandon that tradition and change the day of worship for his disciples? Now, if it was his intent, he would have known it on this day, wouldn't he? He would have known it right from the start, where he was going and what he was going to do. He would have known it when he did and said these things. Was it his intent to change the fourth commandment or to abolish it? Because, you see, this is what's at issue in many people's minds, is that the fourth commandment, specifically, was abolished. Now, the arguments that are advanced on this, well, the 10 Commandments were abolished, and 9 of them were reinstated in the New Testament, is all just so much jargon that people toss around to justify or to explain the fact that the fourth commandment, the Sabbath day, specifically was done away with. Now, can you grasp the enormity of the task that would lie ahead if Jesus were thinking of abrogating the fourth commandment and changing the day of worship for the followers of the same God that everybody had followed all the time through the Old Testament? It's a challenge, isn't it, to make a change of that scope or that extent. Was it his intent to switch the day of rest and worship from the seventh day to the first day? And if so, what would have been the consequences of that change? What would have been the results? First, it would have been necessary to clearly and definitively to have announced the change and given the reason for it. I mean, you can't make that kind of a change, a historic change, left-handedly or behind the back or unintentionally or accidentally. That's pretty significant business we're dealing with here. That change would need to be announced. It would have to be explained, a reason given for it, and also some authority put behind it. There would have been a point in time for the changeover to have taken place. That also would need to be established. Because right now, when Jesus is in this first event in the synagogue, preaching on the Sabbath day, saying, this day, the Sabbath day, this is fulfilled in yours, that change has not taken place. Nothing of it has been revealed to anyone at this time. So at some point in time, there is to be a time for it. There would have to be a recognition that the change had been made after that and why it had been made. This isn't the sort of thing you slip into gradually. Now, bear in mind that for years after the ascension of Christ, the entire Christian church was composed entirely of Jews and proselytes. I mean, all of them. All the way up until finally the conversion of Cornelius. This is the first time, but Cornelius himself was something of a proselyte. He was already a God-fearer. He was not somebody who was, just a Gentile who worshiped some other God entirely. All the way up until a certain point, years after the ascension of Christ, the church was composed entirely of Jews and proselytes. And there was no wholesale conversion of Gentiles until Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey in Acts 13. Keep that fact clearly in mind. Now, you can search through the Gospels, through the book of Acts, all the way up through chapter 12, and you do not find one word of controversy regarding the Sabbath. Is that possible? If the change from Sabbath to Sunday had been made prior to this time, how could that change have possibly been made without major controversy arising in the New Testament church? Because later, we have a huge controversy that arises over the issue of circumcision. And circumcision, as important as it was, did not rise to the level of the Sabbath, which was a sign between Israel and God that they were His people, and a sign for them as to who their God was. Notice, not just how to worship Him, but of who He was. This is an important distinction, which is often lost on many people. So we understand that then, that you search this, there's nothing there about it. And if that change had been made, I submit to you, it would be there. Their announcement would have been made, explanations of it would be there, controversy would have arisen over it. The Jews would have been in an uproar over the question of the observance of the Sabbath day. But the fact is, all of the Christians throughout those first years, all being Jews and proselytes, were already Sabbath keepers. It was their custom, it was what they routinely did, and they just kept on doing it like they always had. And no issue was ever raised over it at this time. You'll find no instructions for a change in the day of worship, not even any breadcrumbs that you can follow to indicate that the change might have been made. There is nothing there at all. Now, this is important because a change in the day of worship would not have merely implied a change in somebody's custom. Every Jew and for every proselyte, it would have implied a change in their God. That, my boys and girls, would be a very significant change indeed. Now, you tell me, could such a change have been made up to Acts 13, the New Testament, without even so much as a ripple showing on the surface of the New Testament? Not a chance. Not a chance. But now the gospel is going to the Gentiles. Did a change take place as the gospel went out to the Gentiles? In the 13th chapter of Acts, Paul and Barnabas go rolling out on their first missionary journey. They're beginning to take the gospel for the first time to the synagogue, to the Gentiles. In Acts 13, verse 14, when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them and saying, "You men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on." So Paul stood up, beckoned with his hand and said, "You men of Israel and you that fear God, give audience." Now, he went to the synagogue. The gospel had to go to the Jew first, so he went where the Jews were when they were there, which was the Sabbath day. You can find all kinds of reasons why Paul would have been there, apart from the fact that the church was still observing the Sabbath. Up to this point, You can find all kinds of reasons for that. Now, after this follows Paul's gospel to the Jews. Now, I gave a sermon some little time ago in which I went through this, but I will point it out to you again. There are a number of illustrations of the gospel preached by both Peter and Paul in the New Testament. And what's fascinating about those is the difference in the approach they take. Not the fundamentals, but the approach they take, first with Jews and then with Gentiles. But in both of these cases, as their sermons are written down in the book of Acts as to what they actually are saying to these people, they never discuss the question of any change in the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Never comes up at all. There is nothing involved, in fact, with the method of the worship of God that it ever so much as raised. What is important to these guys is the history of Israel as it leads up to the Messiah, his suffering and death, and more important than anything else, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the key element of their gospel. You can read this whole message of Paul for yourself, and you'll find not a word about a change of the Sabbath. Naturally, what would have been the effect of such a change? Well, such a change as this, even in their customs, would have had a different reaction, even from as bad a reaction as he had among the Jews in the synagogue. But go on down, pass down to the end of Paul's message to verse 42. When the Jews had gone out of the synagogues, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Not the next day, not Sunday, not tomorrow after the Sabbath, not the first day of the week, the next Sabbath. Nobody says anything. And when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. When the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy, and they spoke against the things that were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. What was their problem? It wasn't that Paul had changed the Sabbath day. It was that he was successful, that people were following Christ. They were believing in the resurrection of Christ. They were believing that Jesus was the Messiah. It had nothing to do with which day they were going to be worshipped on. As you go on to the gospel of the Gentiles, he preaches in a synagogue on the Sabbath. The next Sabbath, the whole city, Gentiles and everybody, come together to hear him, and they are still doing their preaching on the Sabbath day. No change. Acts 17. Acts chapter 17. Verse 1. When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was. It's an interesting little side note here. The Greek word translated manner is ethos, which is exactly the same word that's translated custom for Jesus, where Jesus, as his custom was, went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Paul, as his custom or ethos was, went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. It was what Paul did. It was a part of their worship. It was a part of the identity of their God. Nothing had changed. They were continuing on as they had for generations of Jews in observing the Sabbath day. Opening and alleging, he says, that Christ must needs have suffered, risen from the dead, that this Jesus whom I preach to you is Christ. But not a word about a change in a day of worship. In the early days of the Christian faith, in fact, in all the years that are recorded in the pages of the New Testament, the Christian church looked to the outside world like nothing more than another Jewish sect. The reason they looked that way was because they observed basically the same things. They worshipped on the Sabbath day, just like Jews did. They observed the other holidays, just like the Jews did. And that was to them, to the Gentiles around them, said, oh, well, that's just, you got the Pharisees, you got Sadducees, you got Christians. They're just different people. Now, passing on down to Acts, the 20th chapter, because I just made a statement that I need to back up. I said they not only observed the Sabbath day, they also observed the Jewish holidays. Acts 20, verse 4. There accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. They all went ahead and waited for us at Trophimus. These are just interesting travel details, but he says that we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them in Troas, and there we abode 7 days. They planned their travel according to the Jewish calendar. Of course they would. You wouldn't take off in the middle of the days of unleavened bread and spend those important days, at sea somewhere, when you could actually spend those days with the disciples. So they stayed until the days of unleavened bread were over, and they went on their way. Think that's a little bit far-fetched? Well, as an indication, that's not enough that they were keeping the days of unleavened bread. Take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, in 1 Corinthians 5, we have this curious incident of where the Corinthian church, which were pretty exalted in their own eyes, to use Paul's expression, puffed up, because they had not even considered the fact that they were tolerating in their midst a person who was sinning in a most egregious and most unfortunate way. And so Paul told them, he said, look, you're not doing this right. Get this man out of the church, because, and then he says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. If you just tolerate a little bit of sin in your congregation, the next thing you know, it's going to spread all over the place. Let's deal with it. Get him out of here. Then he says this in verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump. And then he says something funny. He says, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. Now, what feast in the world, I ask you, can this possibly be that the Corinthian church was being said, let's keep the feast? The Feast of the Epiphany? Feast of John the Baptist? Feast of, whatever? No. Let's keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The Corinthian church, at this late date, a Gentile church, was merrily keeping the days of unleavened bread, and they had put leaven out of their homes because he says, as you are unleavened, just like the Jews were doing up until this time. Now, I know this will be shocking to a lot of people, but it's right there on the page. Paul is exhorting a Gentile church to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then there's this interesting one in Colossians 2, verse 16. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a passage of Scripture that people who want to argue with us about whether you should keep holy days or not often bring up. What about Colossians 2:16? My question is, well, what about it? What does it say? I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version here. Therefore, do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths. These are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Do not let anyone disqualify you, insisting on self-abasement and worship of angels, dwelling on visions and puffed up without cause by a human way of thinking. Now, if you'll parse this passage very carefully, just look at it very carefully, what you see is a church that is observing the Sabbath and the festivals, but is being condemned for feasting on those days by Greek ascetics who don't like the idea of eating and drinking and having a good time. Simple as that. Because, if you're going to say that if you're not, that the passage says you're not supposed to keep a Sabbath or a holy day or a new moon, then you have to conclude that you're not supposed to eat or drink either. Because what he says is, let no one condemn you in matters of food and drink, or in observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths. The church in Colossae, a Gentile church by all reckoning, was observing the Sabbath and the festivals and the new moons. Whatever they did at that, we don't really know, but they did. And consequently, they're being criticized for it. And Paul says, don't let them get your goat on it. Don't pay any attention to these people. It's truly ironic that this is a popular proof text against the observances, because, in fact, this particular text shows that the Colossian church was observing the holy days at this time, and there's not a word here for Paul to tell them not to, and they were observing the Sabbath. It's all here. But then someone's going to ask the question, well, doesn't John mention the Lord's Day, Sunday as the Lord's Day, in the book of Revelation? Well, no, actually, he doesn't. Here specifically is what John says. It's in Revelation chapter 1, and I'll begin reading in verse 9. Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. I, John, who am your brother and companion in tribulation, and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos for the word of the Lord and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard a great voice by me as a trumpet. Notice, there's not a word here about a day of the week. Not Sunday, not anything. He just says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Now, if John is indeed referring to a day of the week, and if we are to use the Bible as our best historical source, what did he mean when he said the Lord's day? Because the fact is, there is not a single reference in history or anywhere else to identify Sunday as the Lord's day until the last half of the 2nd century. It's in the apocryphal Gospel of Peter that his Sunday is referred to as the Lord's Day. And prior to that time, there is no mention of it in that connection at all. What you do have is this particular passage in Luke. It's only one verse. You don't even need to turn to it. I'll just read it to you. Luke 6, verse 1. I'm sorry, you may want to turn to this because it is more than one verse. Luke 6, I'll begin reading in verse 1. It came to pass on the 2nd Sabbath after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. Now, this is a really curious expression, and most people read over it and don't even notice it. He says, on the 2nd Sabbath after the first. What on earth does that mean? Where in the Bible do you have Sabbaths being counted off? Well, it's easy. It is that 7 Sabbaths that you count down between Passover and Pentecost. So what he is saying is this is on the 2nd Sabbath after the first Sabbath of the 7 weeks counting down to Pentecost when this took place. It's in the spring. It's when the grain is still in the field, because from Passover to Pentecost, all the different grains in Israel came ripe at different times, starting with barley and ending with wheat, which was down around Pentecost. Well, certain of the Pharisees said to him, why are you doing that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day? Now, that was their idea. There was nothing in the Bible to say that you couldn't walk through the fields, grab yourself a handful of corn, rub it between your hands and pop it in your mouth and chew on it going down the road. Nothing, whatever. But that was one of their rules that they had. And Jesus said, haven't you read so much as this, that what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him, that they went into the house of God and did take and eat the showbread and gave to them that were with him? That is not lawful, but for the priests to eat. Jesus said what they did was not lawful. Then he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath day. Now here's my question at this point, is if we're going to talk about a Lord's Day, why would one assume that that day is anything other than the Sabbath day? Because he says, Son of Man's Lord of the Sabbath. John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. I'm not sure that's what he meant. I think he may have been referring to the eschatological day of the Lord, but that's beside the point. What is to the point is that if he was thinking about day of the week, it almost had to be the Sabbath. Now, I think it is clear enough that in the apostolic era of the church, there was one Sunday in the year that was observed. The day of the first fruits were offered. That's the day when the wave sheaf was offered in the temple. It was also the day that Christ first appeared to his disciples and the day that he was presented to God as the first fruits from the dead. It was the morning after his resurrection. It was indeed a Sunday morning. It is that singular day in the year that is called in your New Testament the first day of the weeks. You see it in your King James Bible repeatedly as the first day of the week, first day of the week. It's in the plural. And actually it is the first day of the weeks leading up to Pentecost, when there is a second Sabbath after the first, which was described before. Now, otherwise, the church, being at first composed of good Jews and later of many Gentiles, they continued to observe the Sabbath. They continued to observe the festivals. There was this one day in the year in which they did meet on the first day of the weeks because it was the first day, that day of the wave sheaf offering. How did the Sabbath get lost, if that's the case? Like I said, if you're going to look around and try to find out how did we get to the modern world where the vast majority of the Christian world observes Sunday as their day of worship, how did we get from the complete loss of the Sabbath day and this changeover that took place? Well, the story is told in great detail in Sam Bakioki's landmark history, which is entitled From Sabbath to Sunday. And as you might expect, the change took place over rather a long period of time. The focal point for most people tends to be along about the end of the first century and some controversies that were going on in there. But what I think probably not very many people really realize is that the church, the Christian religion as a whole, regardless of whatever particular stripe of Christian it was, for 400 years after the ascension of Christ, still observed the Sabbath day in one way or another. They observed both the Sabbath and Sunday. They observed Sunday because, as they put it, that was the day of the resurrection of our Lord and so forth. But the Sabbath was a day of rest. Sunday was not. And so they went on down for generations. And Allie and I were wondering as we came over here today if there is perhaps some hangover of that ancient custom in our weekend that we have today, which involves Saturday and Sunday, not Sunday and Monday, but the way in which modern time goes. But here there's a decretal written by Pope Innocent I in about 417 A.D., it became canon law of the church that the church should absolutely not observe the sacraments on Friday or Saturday. Now think about that for a minute. All the way up to this point, the church was still allowing, many parts of it were still observing the sacraments on Friday night or Saturday, which, of course, by the Jewish reckoning, Friday night and Saturday are the Sabbath day. What's he doing here? Well, what has happened, and it's happened well before this, and it goes on for a long time after this, is that because, perhaps initially because of persecutions that were arising against the Jews in Rome, that the Roman church began more and more to try to distance itself from the Jews. They called the Sabbath a fast day, which was in complete contradiction to anything Jews ever done as a custom, but for them it was a feast day, a day when food was supposed to be plentiful and supposed to be good and a lot of it to eat. So the Roman Catholic Church, or they weren't Roman Catholic at this time, but the Roman Church began to declare that the Sabbath should be a fast day, and that Sunday became the feast day for the church. But they rested on Saturday. They did not work on that day. It was still the Sabbath day and was still recognized to be the Sabbath day as such. It reveals, up through the 4th century, that the majority of the Christian world up until that time was still observing the Sabbath day in some form, up to the 5th century. There are two contemporary historians, Sozomen about 440 and Socrates about 439, that confirm this. I thought Socrates' statement was the most interesting. He says, and I'm going to quote from him, "Although almost all churches throughout the world celebrate the sacred mysteries," and by that he means the Eucharist or the sacraments, almost all churches throughout the world celebrated the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week. Yet the Christians of Alexandria and Rome, on account of some ancient tradition, have ceased to do this. So you've got a picture here that the majority of the Christian world, the vast majority of it, probably 90% of the Christian world up until this time, was still observing the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the sacraments of the church. In other words, they were using Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, as a day of worship through the 5th century. It was Rome and Alexandria that had ceased to do so long before that, as late as the 5th century. It's not saying too much either, I think, to say that the Roman Church was determined to stamp out Sabbath observance because of their command to fast on the Sabbath. And what is interesting about this command on the Sabbath continued up until well after 1000 A.D. And it was a factor in the split that took place between the church at Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church, because the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't want to fast on the Sabbath day. They were still taking account of the Sabbath day for 1,000 years after Christ's ascension. Now, you can see perhaps then why I said as I began this message today that the entire Christian world, not just the entire known, all there was to Christianity during the days that Jesus walked the earth, during the days of the apostles, and while every word of your New Testament was written, the entire Christian community observed the seventh-day Sabbath day. Then the question comes down to the modern time. You begin to realize, yes, it was changed. It was changed by human authority. Then you have to ask yourself, well, why did they do that? And perhaps even more important, did they have the authority to do that? Was it right or was it heresy? And it's a decision which a person in the modern world has to deal with, because it boils down to not merely a sectarian custom, not merely to a little matter of doctrine from one place to another. What it really boils down to is a question of who is your God? What is his name?